Welcome to the Practice You podcast. My name is Elena Brower. Let's dive into today's conversation regarding life's myriad transitions and how we refine our responses in our relationships, our wellness, our households, our work, and in our practices. You are invited to learn and love and listen with me. Welcome to Practice You. Thank you so much for joining the Practice You podcast. My name is Elena Brower, and we have a very special guest today. She is the author of one of my favorite books of this year, I think one of the most important books of our time. It's called Hospicing Modernity. And this wonderful author's name is Vanessa Machado de Oliveira. I am so honored to have you here, Vanessa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elena, for inviting me.
Yes. Going to start with Bio's take on this book. May I?
Yeah, of course.
Quote, "This book is rude, like the shaman's confident cackle, like the punch of an elder whose eyes shimmer with a secret. Like a trickster's feverish dance to a drumbeat in a time supposedly past." And right there, my fellow modern citizen, right there, in the author's cosmological rudeness, lies her deepest medicine. Her generous gift to the need to upset the terraforming coloniality of white modernity. Navigating her rigorous work is an exercise in defamiliarizing modernity as the air we breathe, the site of our persistent illnesses, and the earthly thing that can give way to something else. It is time to gather, and we can start here together. So that's Bio Komolafe's take on this book. So welcome in to this wonder. I want to start with where you came from so that our listener has an idea of the cradle of paradoxes, as you call it, from which you've come. And then we'll move on into defining modernity.
Okay.
So you were born, what year were you born, actually?
1976.
Okay, so I'm just 6 years older than you are. Wonderful. You were born in a mixed heritage family of basically cultures in dissonance, as you write, German and Indigenous ancestry in a place known as Brazil. Like, it doesn't get any sort of more paradoxical than that. I'm going to just own, this is the first time I read in a place known as. Like, I've lived almost 53 years. And it didn't dawn on me until reading your book, the arbitrariness of the naming of the places. So thank you for that. Your father's was a German-speaking family, right?
Yes.
And can you tell me a little bit about where your mother came from?
So my grandmother is Guarani, the Guarani ethnicity. It's an ethnic group in Brazil that is an indigenous group. It's the south of Brazil up to Paraguay and other Latin American countries that they live. They are nomadic. So my grandmother was very much described as stubborn and somebody who embodied resistance. So one of the things that happened to her was that she had to go to Christian schools, right, missionary schools, and she would run away from that. And then she was forced to marry a much older white man, and she had children with this man. But when my mom was born, it was a time where she had left this man and was living in the streets, basically, right? So indigenous people in Brazil who are nomads, they roam, and she was part of that tradition. So when my mom was born, she was born without having a permanent home, and up to when she was 2 years old, she was living that life. So she associates indigeneity with scarcity, dispossession, and shame. And then at 2 years old, actually, she was taken into the former family of my grandmother and adopted, not formally, but effectively by the white man that had been her husband before. So she has this sense of being saved by a white man, which played out again when she had the opportunity to marry my dad, who, coming from a German-speaking family, with ties to the agrarian expansion in Brazil. So my dad, as the youngest of six brothers, would hear stories from his brothers of the agrarian expansion in Brazil, which means indigenous genocide, of how they were killing indigenous people, basically. So they would leave blankets with viruses that the communities were not protected against. They would try to trade, exchange things that were contaminated, poisoned sugar or contaminated flour, that would then lead to the death of the people who were part of a territory, and then they would be able to occupy and declare it a territory without people, so that they could have the land for agriculture. So my dad, hearing that, he wanted to make a stance about it, a progressive stance about it. He said, "This is horrendous, this is violent, and I don't want any part of it, and I'll actually do something about it," which was to marry an indigenous person, an indigenous woman. He was also very much influenced by cowboy films that were very popular at the time. So, and he was against the cowboy stance of marrying the white woman at the end, but having a passion for the indigenous woman. So it was super problematic. And more problematic yet was the fact that although he wanted to marry an indigenous woman to stop state-sanctioned violence, which is a progressive stance, this desire to stop the violence, he still believed in the superiority of German culture and white supremacy, basically. So he wanted to whiten the genetic stock of the person he married as a way of offering a way out of poverty into social mobility, a stance of trying to stop state-sanctioned violence. So it's very paradoxical.
Wow.
Both progressive and extremely problematic. And so I feel that I was born from that paradox, from that stance.
It's interesting, on page 15 in the Roman numerals in the introduction, you talk about this. You say, my father understood that the system was rigged, but he enjoyed the benefits afforded by it. And I think a lot of us, at least I know probably a few listeners of mine, are in that very position right now. And I think that's why this book is so important. And also thank you for pointing out that agrarian expansion is a euphemism for indigenous genocide. These are the real serious structural injustices that now we start to understand that we never were taught in school in the 70s and the 80s.
Absolutely. We were taught that this was the only way forward, the single story of progress, development, and civilization.
Right, right. Your grandmother, Vitalina, I just want to take a moment to honor her. What a quandary, and what a beauty she must have been, caught between these two worlds. You were taught indirectly by both of your parents that there are these deep contradictions between thinking, saying, and doing. And I think that's the space that this modern culture is in right now. I think we're stuck right there. I'd love to talk about the definition of modernity. And I also want to just point out to our listener that your academic trajectory, should this be of interest to our listener, you hold a Canada Research Chair in Race, Inequalities, and Global Change. You've worked at various universities internationally since 2004. You have been a tenured full professor at the Department of Educational Studies at Canada's University of BC since 2017. You've held academic positions in Ireland, in New Zealand, in Finland. Can we just say properly, Aotearoa is New Zealand, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. And you became a full professor at age 34. So we are speaking with somebody whose voice needs to be heard broadly, and that's my intention here today. Let's talk about the definition of modernity, because this is what we're hospicing. This is the big issue against which we are all standing, and in the soup in which we're all swimming. Talk to us a little bit about this.
Yeah, it's actually very difficult to talk about it just as a story, because it's more than that. It's something that affects our neurobiology, not only how we understand ourselves, how we feel, but also the scope of relationships we have and what we can experience as real or ideal. So I often use an image to talk about modernity, to connect the different elements of it. And the image is also in the book. It's the image of a house. So I ask you to imagine a house sitting on a planet, and imagine that this house is exceeding the limits of the planet. It's becoming bigger than the planet. And this house has a foundation of separation or separability, which is the imposed sense of separation. Because the thing is that we are not separated. We are part of the planet. We are part of the metabolism of the planet. But the house creates a sense, an imposed sense of separation between us and the land, us humans and other species. And then it creates also hierarchies of value between cultures that rank cultures in relationship to one another according to how they contribute to the house, to the construction of the house. And it also ranks individuals against each other. So that sense of separation creates the conditions for us for an inherent loss of the intrinsic value of life. So you are only worthy of being alive if you contribute to the economies that are at place, that are happening within that house. So it starts from the foundation of separation, and then there are two carrying walls. The first carrying wall is the carrying wall of the modern nation state. And we tend to think about the nation state as something that is there to protect people. But the history of the nation state is about the protection of property and property owners. So it's the protection of capital. So when we think about human rights, indigenous rights, civil rights, labor rights, all these rights have been dispensed when there is interest convergence between the protection of capital and the protection of people. When there is no interest convergence, then generally the states revert to the protection of capital only.
Right, right.
The other carrying wall is one that is more about the ways of knowing within the house. So that carrying wall offers a single story of what progress means, of what development means, and of what civilization means. Basically, also of what human evolution means. And this story has the power because of what comes with it and the weight of it, and also the militarization of it, carries the power to kill other stories, kill other possibilities. So sometimes this is referred to as epistemicides. And this is mostly carried out through education.
Wow.
And the media.
Whoa.
I know. Yeah.
Whoa. I'm sitting in my 5th grade, 7th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade history classes going, just gasping. We were lied to. We were totally lied to.
And it's still there. I don't think the educators believe they were lying. They believe they were saving us from other possibilities. But they didn't understand they were imposing a very tunnel vision of what the future would be, or what progress and development civilization would be. And they didn't realize the extent of the violence of that story. And the last thing of the house is the roof. So there have been different roofs of this house across history. And the current one is the roof of shareholder, speculative, algorithmic capitalism, where AI actually has the power to define our desires, right? And where the idea of the production of profit for anonymous shareholders is what sustains, is the beams of that roof. So we talk about the fact that the roof is damaged, like the infrastructure is compromised, because that can be sustained, right, for the planet or for the house itself. That's the other thing. So the house is full of cracks, of different kinds of crises: ecological, social, mental health crisis, housing crisis within the house. And one of the things that we invite people to realize is that the house was created and is maintained by violence. So expanding the house is also expansion of violence, because the sewage of the house is going into the planet and creating all kinds of ecocides and genocides. But people are still, because we've lived in this house for so long, our livelihoods are underwritten by this violence, right? We cannot imagine anything else. When we think about the future, we think about a better version of the house for ourselves. And I have to say that after the war, the Second World War, for that generation that was born after that, which includes my generation, your generation, there was the sense of recovery and cumulative prosperity that was passed from one generation to another. And what's happening right now is that that sense cannot be sustained anymore. So we have generations now coming in and saying that the house is the source and the driver of the climate and nature emergency, and that their future has been stolen from them. They've been shortchanged. At the same time that they also still want the house, because we have not been able to open up the imagination for something that is not the house. Apart from the people who are still outside of the house and living in a planet that is struggling with the sewage of the house. So we work very closely with the Hunikui people, who are indigenous people in the Amazon, and they are fighting for a different kind of existence where they are pointing to the problems of the house. So they fight against, for example, carbon markets and carbon trading, because the carbon markets and carbon trading, they financialize the nature, they monetize the forest, they commodify the forest. And they are saying that this is the source of the problem, the commodification of nature, seeing nature as property, as resource, rather than something that we are part of. And they are representing then the voice of the forest, trying to tell us, especially the Amazon forest, right, what has gone wrong. And it is time for us to face the wrongs so that we can wake up, step up, and show up differently as we face the challenges we're facing now and the challenges that we will face also in the future.
I have a 17-year-old son, and I'm hearing him in what you're saying, this sort of lack of understanding about what is possible, a lack of vision, because we know that it's all kind of unsustainable. And so how is he and his generation meant to, quote unquote, make a living among these archetypes of cognitive dissonance, And how does he dig deeper? How do they exist differently than we've been existing?
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. These are all the questions that this book asks in Hospicing Modernity. You actually walk us through at the very beginning, a warm-up into the future. You take us. In August 2020, you were presenting a paper on the topic of what schools might look like in 2048. And you walk us into it, a virtual reality walk through what these next few years are going to look like up until 2048. It is harrowing what is happening here. It's like a horror film.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about the period between 2018 and 2027, and I'm quoting from the book, marked by an interruption of our dreams of consumerism as prosperity. Wow. School climate strikes, young people become aware our chosen path is both violent and unsustainable, COVID-19, mounting economic crisis. I mean, you basically just call it out. The most harrowing part, though, especially in light of the fact that I just talked to you about my kid, by 2027, alpine skiing is only possible in the Himalayas. Mm-hmm. Wow. This is giving our listener a little taste. So we all, at a certain point before 2048, and this is how Vanessa presented this, and I'm saying this in the past tense, imagine it's 2048 and what we had to learn collectively and quickly and without schools or moral manifestos. We had to learn how to heal intellectually, emotionally, relationally, economically, ecologically, and politically, as you can easily imagine. We had to learn how to abolish colonial and racial violence, inequality, hierarchies of worth and separation. We had to learn how to center the earth and decenter our egos, identities, narratives, and projections. We had to learn to age and die in generative ways. I'm coming back to that one. We had to learn to care for rather than compete with everything and everyone. Care for rather than compete with everything and everyone. We had to learn how to plant, repurpose technology, compost, repair, regenerate everything. From the perspective of 2048, we also had to learn how to prioritize the common good for humans, for non-humans, and for the planet. We had to learn how to use words and conversation carefully and wisely, with humility and maturity. And we had to learn how to own up, sober up, clean up, grow up, show up, and exist differently. This is such a helpful and also, like I said, very harrowing look at what's to come. And this leads us really into the definition of modernity that we've sort of been skirting around. The competing stories about modernity from different disciplines, angles, perspectives, agendas. You say that the general overview that you present here in this book maps the difference between these stories in terms of where people think modernity came from and why it's here and what it's given us and what is at stake when it disappears. This is something that really helped me out. Modernity as coloniality. I think that's where we should start, because coloniality is by its very existence why we live in this paradigm right now.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I think, the first line of what we have to manage, what we have to handle, what we have to eradicate.
Mm-hmm. Or at least to face, right, that our complicity in historical and systemic and ongoing harm. And it's difficult because the structure of the House of Modernity, if we've lived enough within it, and we have all lived, if we're listening to this podcast and have the literacies to talk about these things, it's like we have the structure of the house as the structure of our imagination. So anytime that we are invited to look at the making of the house, like the making of a sausage, right? We have the impulse to reject that, to deny that, to deflect from that, and to escape into an idealization. And that difficulty to sit with the reality of things, and both the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the fucked up, both within us and around us, because we're part of humanity as a point in a continuum, right? So, and humanity is generally also idealized. We talk about something good being human and something evil being inhuman. And that distinction itself already creates this disidentification with what's broken, and it prevents us from sitting with that, and from, in the book we talk about, from composting the shit, the saturated shit we have inherited and that we produce every day. So that composting, the turning of decaying matter into new soil, is extremely important for us to be able to get out of the lockdown of the imagination into the only possibility I want and I can see is the house, right? So for us to be able to break away from that, it's necessary perhaps to also understand this as a neurobiological impairment. So colonialism and coloniality, which is, we put coloniality together with modernity so that when we look at the shiny side of the things that we were conditioned to value, we also can see the costs and the violence that are necessary to maintain it. And for us to be able to sit with that, we will need to expand our internal capacity and hack our neurobiology to learn to find joy in the composting and facing reality. It's neurochemically different, a different kind of joy. So within modernity, we have been conditioned to look for happiness in specific things, in specific forms of achievement, of mastery, of control, of certainty, and also of specific forms of community that generally require people to be on the same page so that we feel validated and cared for and cuddled, right? I think these are all important things, but there's also joy in the struggle and in growing up and in the pains of growing up. So even our relationship with pain, with death, with loss, with grief has been conditioned according to these parameters, right? According to the lockdown. And this lockdown is not working right now because as the house is fractured and starts to fall apart in different ways for different people, and often we think about social collapse or ecological collapse. We think about the collapse around us, but the house is within us. And if this house is cracking within us, the social and ecological collapse will come from inside as well. So as the fires and the floods and the famine are happening outside, the fires and the floods and the famine are happening inside us, in our unconscious. And this is affecting our lives in ways that we cannot trace, in ways that we do not expect. So we find a lot of people with a lot of anxiety, with a lot of depression, with self harming tendencies, and anger and frustration. And this all comes also from the mourning of the expectations of the house that cannot live up to its promises. But it's also coming from the pain of the land, the pain of the beings that are dying in the land so that we can have our comfort, the pain of other people whose labor is being exploited, whose livelihoods are being destroyed, so that we can have the technology to be able to talk to each other across spaces, right? So the waters are rising, and not only outside of us, they are rising within. So for the Hunikui people of the Amazon, for example, what they are worried about is that for the people who have been buffered from the violence and from the effects of the violence, it's going to be a global mental health crisis that is accelerating humanity into a premature path of extinction.
I think we're there.
Yeah, we're there.
We're there. You have in chapter 3, which you label to be the most important chapter. So, listener, if you are choosing to get this book and choosing yourself to be part of this conversation, which I would strongly recommend, Hospicing Modernity, chapter 3, tools to kind of their frameworks, images, strategies to kind of equip us better to hold space for complexity and all these paradoxes, and to step into spaces where we don't agree necessarily with the core values, but we can actually just communicate and be humans together without being so obsessed with agreement. Tool number 1 is mastery and depth education. So we've been basically inculcated in mastery education, not depth. I am imagining that we're a few teachers strong here listening to this podcast, and I'd like for you to talk a little bit about, please, mastery education versus depth education and the importance of depth.
Okay, thank you. As an educator, that's one of the passions. And as I'm moving into a role as a dean of a faculty of education, the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria. So this has been on my mind for a long time. I'm no longer a Canada Research Chair in Race, Inequalities, and Global Change. I've had to withdraw from that in order to become a dean. So the best way to explain the difference between mastery and depth education is through analogies or illustrations, right? Images. So mastery education is, you would need to imagine a cup and tea as education being poured into a cup to be measured so that we know how much knowledge you have. The tea represents that knowledge. Or you could think about the support you would have to climb up a peak and arrive at that peak and conquer. And I'm using that word on purpose, conquer the peak and feel empowered at the end of that journey. So it's very much outcome based. It's very much about mastery of content or skills. And it's also dopamine seeking. Now, depth education, need to imagine a different scenario. So imagine that depth education is about peeling a truckload of onions and cooking together in the midst of all the crying that would entail, so that we can see the different layers of things and we can expand our capacity to hold together all the different moving layers of complexity, all the paradoxes, and to process the complex emotions that come with that without flattening these layers. It's also in relationship to the mountain metaphor or the peak metaphor. Instead of a peak, depth education is more about deep diving in the freezing ocean. And in order to realize through the pain and the numbing and the heat that comes after that, once you are in the freezing water, that your body is water and that you are also the water that you're diving into. And you are all the toxins and the pollution that we also put in the water, right? So when we're connecting to so-called nature, that is also part of us, we cannot just select the beauty and the elation of it, like to connect with the whales, the moon, the sun, the flowers. We need to connect with everything that goes on, and not forget that even the technological pollution that we return to nature, the minerals, the toxicity, and the plastic, they are also all part of nature. So plastics come from our fossils that have lived a long time ago, and they're still, if you're thinking about life in a different way, they're still alive, right? So if we can have that expansion of not only frames of reference, but also affective landscapes and possibilities of relationality, possibility of seeing our connection with living fossil fuels, that is depth education. It's not about mastering anything, but about digging deeper and connecting and relating wider, in expanding our capacity to feel that and to honor our obligations and responsibility towards what's happening right now.
My jaw is on the floor. Thank you for that orientation. Tool number 2, wording and worlding the world. Reality is so much bigger than language, and there are questions that we can ask, and I'll be brief in this section because I have a couple more questions that I don't want to miss. Instead of asking, when you hear a story, is this story true? Or what does this story mean? Questions that come from, as you say, the expectation that stories will describe reality and convey some sort of fixed meaning. The approach to storytelling to which you're inviting us invites us to ask, what is this story trying to move? What does it do over time and to time itself? How does this story change the concept of time? This is a new way of thinking about everything we have ever been taught, every story we've ever been told. And the emphasis is really more on a practice, you say, of consent, of trust, respect, reciprocity, accountability. We're requesting reverence toward non-human beings who occupy a position of authority, if we're really honest, as forest custodians. Excuse me. We are not sovereign here as humans. Doesn't matter that we have mouths and can talk and language and computers and now AI. Mm-hmm. Tool number 3, the bus within us. Anything that signals internal multiplicity, and I think this is really the source of all of this problem, is that we think, first of all, that we're better than, we're more powerful than, we're overlords over nature. But the mistaken construct of modernity is that maturity is associated with the rule of mind and reason over emotions and the body. And you're right. This mature self should be unified in a coherent personality, and that is to say, under control, that sees both the world and itself objectively. In social media, the desire for coherence and self-transparency can be seen at work in echo chambers. Like, I'm in that echo chamber. I'm trying desperately to get out of it. I'm trying to work in other circles and communicate with people who completely disagree and learning how we actually do agree. These are all ways that we can move forward. But the bus within us, I think, is a really important thing. It's based on a non-Western, non-anthropocentric form of psychoanalysis that locates the origin of the psyche in a conscious, living, quote-unquote, land. And I would love to hear you walk us through this. This really touched me.
Yeah, the bus, as you said, is a useful tool. We invite people to imagine themselves as a bus. It actually doesn't have to be a bus. It can be any image that evokes multiplicity. So there's a multiplicity within the self. In its basic level, if you use the bus, there is a driver, there are passengers at the front, passengers in the middle, passengers at the back, and you are invited to observe the dynamics of the bus and to learn to hold space for that dynamics and to create a meta language of both observation and learning and parenting of what's happening in there, of finding the elders within the bus and the toddlers within the bus and checking what they're saying, what they're thinking, how they're feeling, and why, and bringing them into an invitation for eldership. Everybody goes. And it is an invitation that, unfortunately, our modern system of education denies, right? But if you're looking at education from Indigenous perspectives, as the moment you were born is where you are welcome as an elder already. And the function of the community is to prepare you to become a good elder and ancestor for all relations.
Yeah.
But
we're not taught that.
Yeah, nobody.
But that is not in the curriculum here.
No.
And eldering and elderhood, the reverence for this, I think, is probably one of the most important things we'll talk about today.
And the part about being a good ancestor. So even after death, you're still responsible for what you've done in this life. So responsibility is not in the curriculum, basically. Responsibility for everything. A life as a continuous, and continuous also with all other life forms, not just the human. But the buzz is interesting in the sense that it helps us hold space for our own complexity, because without that, we cannot hold space for the complexity around us. But also, you were one of the first people who I saw make that connection too. Because in the beginning, people still believe that the first deck of the bus, the main deck, is about them. And about the children they were, the experiences they had, and all of things. And this is all true. But there are other decks on the bus where you allow other beings to interact or to intervene and interpolate what's happening on the bus. So there's a deck where you have all your ancestors there, past, present, and future ancestors as well. And there's a deck where there is human and non-human relations. It's also part of your bus. There's a deck where there's no space or time. There's still communication with what goes on in the universe. So the bus, at the very basic level, just allows for the internal complexity to surface and for you to expand your capacity to sit with it. But the other decks allow you to be invited to break away with the conventions of self and time that have been imposed by modernity. So there are beings on your bus that have, and stories that have the potential to change your relationship with time, your relationship with knowledge, your relationship with language, your relationship with your unconscious. And they're there to help. So when you go into a forest, and as I say in the book, you make an offering to the little people who live there. And these are all social constructs. They are human constructs that point to something much bigger that is happening, of the trees being able to talk to you, of the mycelium in the forest being able to interfere with your unconscious, with your neurobiology, through pathways that have been neglected by modernity. So part of, I think, the journey of the bus, of you being familiar with your bus and reactivating these other layers of the self, is to activate capacities that have been exiled from modernity.
Mm. I'm on page 116, which is a perfect segue from this place. And this is not by any means a focus of the book, but it is an important part of it. Neuroscientists who study psychotropic plants used in ceremonies by indigenous communities see serotonin as one of the main neuroendocrine modulators that gives us the sense of connection and entanglement, the delicious entanglement with everything else. That is, a sense of connection occurs when something activates the release and reuptake of serotonin in our bodies. Pedagogically and metaphorically, you write, I will use serotonin as a proxy, this is the important part, for the sense of metabolic entanglement that is repeatedly and deliberately severed by modernity. And so we land in a definition of modernity by way of what it isn't. You propose the hypothesis that by imposing separability, which is what modernity does by design, although not always explicitly, at a basic level, modernity reorients the production, release, and absorption of serotonin as part of a much more complex sort of set of neurofunctional processes. And this reorientation causes us to feel separated from this larger metabolism. It removes the sense of intrinsic value in our lives and in the lives of others. Because of this reorientation, we feel compelled to seek connection and external validation through all these different economies, affective, intellectual, relational, material. This is the fucking chilling part. If we fail to participate in these economies, our serotonin pathways are not activated and we feel isolated and worthless, which makes us feel insecure, alone, unable to relate to others. And this permanent state of separation and perceived disconnection leads to the quality of well-being afforded, for example, in Indigenous communities through continuous collective ceremonial practices, literally exiled from the house of modernity. This is so chilling to me. And I see so many friends, colleagues, even students, yoga students, mentorship students, who are feeling this sense of exile because they do not feel comfortable putting themselves out there in this random, super random social media economy that does actually weirdly drive this system. What upsets me the most about it is that this is completely avoidable, that we can either sort of valorize this global connectivity that we have. Wow, somebody in Denmark just reached out and wants my book signed, and she'll pay for me to ship it to her. What if we stopped valorizing that and started just being with the people that we're around in close proximity? Like, that feels like the most important thing that I can do right now. Weirdly.
It is part of it, I think, but there's also what we need to be vigilant against is that our relationships have also been configured and conditioned, and what we expect from relationships, right, has been configured and conditioned by modernity. So sometimes, or most times, I would say, within the house of modernity, relationships are transactional. So we will be in relationship with as long as people give us what we want from them, rather than being in relationship with so that we can grow into eldership together and go through all the hoops that we have to go through, including the failures, the mistakes, and including facing the good, the bad, the ugly, and the broken and the fucked up within ourselves, including our internal assholes, right? Because we all have them. And to stay in a relationship with that commitment to the whole package of the bus is extremely difficult and requires a lot of stamina for the whole process, patience, compassion, generosity, courage as well, but a lot of maturity. Okay, what I find interesting, like if you're thinking about the psychedelic renaissance, right, in the West, is that as I work with people in the South that who hold the knowledge of the sacred medicines and have held this knowledge for a long time, what they say is that when Western people come to do ceremonies and like let's say ayahuasca, mescaline, psilocybin, all the sacred plants, right? They desire a sense of return to an oceanic state, which the plants can give, but all the education, the indigenous education about the medicines, is actually to ask for their support for the stamina to be responsible and to grow up into an elder, rather than return to the womb of the mother. So there is a sense of self-infantilization within modernity that brings us back to wanting to be coddled. And when we think about relationships, it's oxytocin that we want from it, because that's the only thing we've been exposed to as well, right? So we want that sense of connection associated with a specific neurochemical. When we have the experience of reset of our neurobiology through the ceremonies, if we had the education about accountability, responsibility, and eldership, we would have been seeking something else.
Right. Oy. Oh my God, I feel like I could talk to you for 3 days. I'm on page 161 now, Academia with and Without Arrogance. If you're listening to us, this is a very important and enlightening page. The 3 arrogances to be lost: the smarts, the throne, the stage. The 3 releases: entitlement, exceptionalism, exaltedness. The 3 goals: humility, humor, and hyper self-reflexivity. I would love to close on that, and I want to invite you, if you'd be open to it, to come back for one more time to talk about the 7 steps back and the 7 steps forward.
Thank you. I would love to come back. I love this conversation.
I can't miss that. Hyper self-reflexivity, though, I think is a really good way to close, because it's something accessible that maybe with these releases of these 3 sets of 3, our listener can start to practice this and lose this sense of preciousness about ourselves, self-cherishing, and start to really see the wider scope of things.
Yeah. So self-reflexivity is an invitation to shed the arrogance and to see ourselves as cute and pathetic in the universe, and embrace the responsibility that that entails. We talk about the learning of how do we learn to walk this tightrope between naive hope and escapism from reality and desperate hopelessness, which is also escapism from reality that acknowledges reality, but wants a certainty that comes with that, right? So we talk about humility, honesty, humor, and self-reflexivity as an understanding of where we're coming from, where we're at, where we're going, the fact that we are a point in a continuum, and the invitation to hold all the layers of complexity, both internally and external to the self, without being crushed by this complexity, without feeling overwhelmed or immobilized by this complexity, and approach this with a heart that can be stretched open so that we can understand that vulnerability is a strength in approaching relationships differently. And that vulnerability doesn't mean that boundaries are not in place, actually, but boundaries can be permeable, and we can figure out, and that's something I'm learning too. It's ceremonies that help with that, to protect ourselves, to establish the boundaries, because there's a lot of toxicity around us right now. At the same time that you allow the medicines to interact, right? We all carry medicines, and we have medicines coming to us and help, I believe, coming to us as well. But if we have too much protection, protection also protects us from the medicines that are coming to help. But the discernment that we have to establish boundaries in ways that are healthy and that allow for this permeability and interaction to help us to step up, to wake up, to grow up, and to show up differently. I think that's an education that has been missing as well.
In the biggest way. I cannot thank you enough for your time today, Vanessa, and I look forward. I will definitely be sending you an email before end of day today to schedule our second half. I didn't expect this, and I'm so grateful for your generosity. The 7 steps back and 7 steps forward are, I think, crucial for us as a society to learn, and to hear you speak on them, I think would be a real gift.
Thank you. I would be very happy to come back.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your mind. Thank you for your heart. Thank you for your history. Thank you for your presence. And thank you again for your generosity. Vanessa, thank you.
Thank you.